The chilled crystal glass trembled in Serafina's hand, not from nerves but from a deliberate, calculated tremor. "Oh dear." She cooed, her voice a silken blade slicing through the boardroom's tense silence. "Look. What you've made me do, Alareus water sharp and cold as her tone, cascaded across the sheaf of closing documents, pulling on the polished mahogany before dripping onto my lap. She didn't shove me. A physical assault would have been too crude. Too honest. This was her art form humiliation served with a saccharine smile. The realtor, a man named Mr. Abernathy, whose ambition was visible in the cut of his suit, froze with a pen hovering over the signature line across the table. My son Julian sighed an exaggerated sound of parental exhaustion aimed at a toddler, not his 78-year-old mother. "Mother, for heaven's sake." He said, his voice stripped of all warmth. "This is a $38 million deal. Can you not sit still for 5 minutes without causing a scene?" Serafina snatched the ruined papers, dabbing at them with a linen napkin, her movements a theatrical display of damage control. "Are you sure you're feeling all right?" Elarashi asked, her eyes glittering with malice. "Perhaps this is all too much for you. We've discussed this. There are facilities, places. That can help when one's mind becomes clouded." She didn't need to say the words nursing home, mental hospital. They hung in the air as foul and suffocating as the sudden scent of her expensive perfume. She turned to the silent-suited onlookers, lawyers, and investors who were now studiously examining their portfolios. "My mother-in-law gets confused," she announced, her voice pitched to Carrie. "She thinks she's a part of these decisions, but she's just a name on an old deed, a formality, a tenanta." Confused old woman. The labels they had stitched onto me over the years felt heavy, but they were a costume I had learned to wear. Julian walked over, not to help me, but to steer me away from the table, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been misplaced. He guided me to a solitary chair in the corner of the room, far from the warmth of the floor-to-ceiling windows, so overlooking the Charleston harbor. "Just sit here. Mother, don't touch anything. Don't say anything. We'll be done soon." His words were not a request, they were a command, the kind one gives to a disobedient doggas. I sat, the cold leather of the chair seeping through my dress. I watched them, Serafina preening in her victory, now directing the staff to reprint the documents, Julian already back at the table. His focus laser in on the numbers, the percentages, the prize. Arriving at the closing, they had forgotten I existed, which was precisely the point. They saw a frail relic, a ghost in their grand machine, unaware that the ghost was the one who had built the engine, laid the tracks, and was now standing with her hand on the brake. They thought this was their moment of triumph, the acquisition of the historic Beaumont estate, a sprawling antebellum plantation house that would cement their place in Charleston's elite. What they didn't know was that every brick of that house, every blade of grass on its manicured lawns, and every dollar changing hands in this room already answered to me, and as they prepared to sign their names to a future, they believed they were stealing. Allowed myself a small, secret smile. The quietest woman in the room always remembers, and my memory was very, very long. My name is Alara Vance. I was born in this city in a house not 2 miles from this sterile boardroom house that smelled of salt water, and sweet grass, a house filled with the love of a man named Arthur, me late husband. He was a man who understood that true strength was not in volume, but in depth. When Julian was just a boy, Arthur would spend hours with him meticulously restoring antique maps, their heads bent together over the fragile parchment. "A map shows you where you are. Son," he'd say, his voice a low rumble, "but a good map shows you all the places you could go." It's about potential. After Arthur passed, that collection of maps was my most treasured possession, a tangible link to a life of shared dreams. I had them hung in the study, a wall of history and love. The week after Serafina moved in, I found the frames empty, stacked in the hallway. The maps themselves were gone when I asked. Her laughter was like shattering glass. "Oh, that dusty old paper, it was making the room smell musty." I had them professionally disposed of. We're putting up modern art. Something with values. He had not just removed paper from a wall, she had torn out a piece of my heart and discarded it as trash. The erasers continued, each one chipping away at my presence. In the home I had shared with Arthur for 50 years. The garden I tended with its heirloom roses and fragrant herbs was paved over for an extension to the patio, so much more practical for entertaining. Serafina had declared as if my peace was an inconvenience to her social calendar. I was introduced to her friends not as Julian's mother, but as Julian's father's widow who lives with us, the slight. Was subtle a careful calibration of language designed to render me an attachment, a responsibility rather than the matriarch of the family. The financial cuts came next. Julian, armed with a spreadsheet, explained that I would need to contribute to my own expenses. It's about fairness, mother. You use the electricity, the water. He conveniently forgot that I had used the entirety of my personal savings to pay off the mortgage on this very house when his first business venture failed, ensuring he and Serafina would have a roof over their heads. My sacrifice was now being itemized on an invoice. The final unforgivable cruelty came the winter. I contracted pneumonia. A week in the hospital left me weak and breathless, longing for the comfort of my own bed when Julian brought me home. I found the door to my bedroom locked. Serafina's cousin, a student, was now renting it. The income is a tremendous help. Serafina explained breezily. My DIL's cold words as if discussing the weather. We've fixed up a lovely little space for you downstairs. The space was the basement, a damp windowless room next to the water heater. It smelled of mildew and neglect. They had moved me down there while I lay in a hospital bed, fighting for breath. You should be grateful, Julian had said, his face a mask of detached logic, that rent means we have one less mouth to feed. That night, lying in the cold, dark, listening to the hum of the house's machinery, I finally understood I was not family. I was a line item in their budget, a problem to be managed. The grief for my son. The boy who once marveled at old maps was a physical ache sharper than the pneumonia had ever been. It was in that cold basement that the ghost they thought me to be began to plot. I was not a victim waiting for the end. I was a strategist planning my opening move. Arthur, my pragmatic, wonderful Arthur, had always insisted on maintaining a substantial life insurance policy for a rainy day, Al-Arahi would say. And sometimes it pours. The check that arrived after his death was a deluge. Julian and Serafina never asked about it. They assumed Arthur's finances, like his maps, were old-fashioned and insignificant. Their ignorance was the first key to their undoing. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to Elias Thorne. Elias was Arthur's oldest friend, a retired wealth manager who lived quietly in Savannah. He was a man who valued discretion above all else, a Southern gentleman of the old school who understood that the most significant battles are fought, not in boardrooms, but in the silent spaces in between. I met him not in his office, but on a bench in Forsyth Park, the Spanish moss dripping from the ancient oaks like a veil of secrets. I told him everything. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the distant fountain. When I finished, he didn't offer condolence. She offered a solution. We will create a fortress. Alara, he said, his voice calm and resolute, and we will build it with invisible bricks over the next 6 months. Elias worked with a quiet brilliance. He established the Cypress Key Trust, domiciled in Delaware. For its impenetrable corporate privacy laws, my name appeared on nothing. The trust was a labyrinth of holding companies and registered agents, a ghost in the financial system. Elias was its sole public-facing trustee. In reality, every decision was mine. Arthur's insurance money became the seed capital. We started small, buying minority stakes in stable, unassuming companies. One of them was a Charleston-based commercial development firm, the very company that had just acquired the rights to restore and sell the Beaumont estate. Quietly, patiently, through multiple subsidiaries of the trust, we acquired shares. 10% 2035, we stopped at 40%, not a controlling interest, but a powerful enough block to sway any major decision. We became the firm's largest single silent shareholder. The true masterstroke was the land itself, the parcel upon which the Beaumont estate site had a complicated title history, tangled in generations of family disputes, using the trust's immense resources. Elias's legal team spent months quietly untangling it, buying out distant heirs, settling ancient claims. 6 months before the estate was even listed for public sale, the Cypress Key Trust became the sole legal owner of the land. The development firm owned the buildings, but I threw the trust down the very ground they stood on. The trap was sea tall. I needed was for the mice to want the cheese. And oh, how they wanted it when the Beaumont estate hit. The market. Serafina became obsessed. It was the ultimate status symbol. You're not on the $64 million deed, the key to the ironclad inner circle of Charleston society. She so desperately wanted to join. They had the ambition, but not the liquidity for the multi-million-dollar deposit. That was when I made my move a Trojan. Horse offered with the trembling hand of a helpless old woman. I found some old bonds of Arthur's, a modest sum I offered to them. It wasn't enough. But it gave them the courage to seek outside financing, and miraculously a private lender reached out to them, an anonymous trust, willing to front the entire deposit on generous terms. The lender was, of course, the Cypress Key Trust. Elias drafted the loan agreement himself. It was a work of art filled with dense legalities and clauses so specific they seemed inconsequential, buried deep within. Was the hook: the trust reserved the right at its sole discretion to withhold the final release of funds. At closing, if that happened, the deal would collapse and their entire deposit would be forfeited to the property seller. Julian, arrogant and rushed, skimmed it. Serafina, concerned only with appearances, didn't read it at all. They signed, sealing their own fate. From my basement room, I watched them celebrate. I listened to their condescending plans to maybe let me live in the guest house if I behaved. Every cruel word, every smug assumption was another nail in their beautifully constructed coffin. They saw an old woman fading into the shadows. They never once thought to ask who was casting them. Now in this boardroom, their moment had arrived. The reprinted documents were distributed. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. His composure restored. All right. We're ready to proceed. He began the signing. Commenced a rustle of paper and the scratch of expensive pens. They moved with the confident grace of victors. When they reached the final document, a land deed transfer, Julian slid it in front of me along. With a pen, Serafina leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. It's just to get your name off the old parcel deed. Ilara, a simple signature, and all this will be behind us. She was pointing to a power of attorney form, granting them full irrevocable control. This was their final checkmate. They needed my signature to clean the title, the last piece of administrative dust before their kingdom was secure. Julian's shadow fell over me. Don't make this difficult, mother, he murmured, his voice low and threatening. Sign it for all of us. I let my fingers rest on the cool paper. I could feel the impatience radiating from them, the barely leashed irritation. The entire room was watching, waiting for the frail old woman in the corner to do as she was told. I took the pen. I felt Serafina's triumphant smirk without even looking at her. Then slowly, deliberately, I placed the cap back on the pen. With a soft click that echoed in the silent room, I folded my hands on my lap and looked up, meeting my son's eyes, and I waited. The silence stretched taut and heavy. Serafina's smile vanished. What are you doing? It's just a formality. Her voice had a brittle edge now. Mother Julian's voice was louder, sharper. You have no reason not to sign. Perhaps she needs it explained in simpler terms. Serafina offered, turning to the lawyers with a look of pained condescension. She's not always clear on these things. Before anyone could respond to her calculated insult, the boardroom doors swung open. Two men entered, their movements precise and silent. The first was the lead project director from the development firm. The second was a man I had never met, but whose reputation preceded him. The Realtor's reaction: the firm's chief legal counsel, a shark in a handmade suit. They ignored Julian and Serafina completely. The project director walked directly to my corner and inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice clear and resonant, we have the final contracts prepared as per your instructions. We are ready for your signature. The room went utterly still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Serafina's perfectly made-up face was a mask of confusion. Her instructions, she repeated, her voice a squeak. What on earth are you talking about? The lawyer stepped forward, placing a slim leather portfolio on the table beside me. He addressed the room, but his eyes were on me, Mrs. Vance, through the Cypress Key. Trustis, a 40% shareholder in the development company, he stated, his tone flat and factual. Furthermore, the trust is the sole legal owner of the parcel of land in which the Beaumont estate is built, without her personal signature authorizing the sale and land transfer. This entire transaction is null and void. The words detonated in the quiet room. I watched the sequence of emotions flicker across Julian's face: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and finally, pure unadulterated horror. He looked as if the floor had dissolved beneath his feet. Serafina whipped her head toward him, her whisper a venomous hiss. You told me she was nothing. You said it was a formality. Tew thought Julian stammered, his gaze darting around the room, seeing not colleagues but witnesses to his spectacular downfall. Mr. Abernathy looked pale, his professional veneer cracking. The investors were now sitting bolt upright, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. I let the beautiful, perfect silence hang in the air for a moment longer, then I reached for the leather portfolio. It seems I said, my voice soft yet carrying to every corner, there has been a misunderstanding of my role in these proceedings. You can't do this. Serafina choked out her face, flushed with rage. The project director gave a small, almost pitying smile. On the contrary, he said gently. She is the only one who can. Julian leaned forward, his palms flat on the table, his composure shattered. Mother, please, he begged, his voice cracking. We can talk about this privately. Just sign the papers privately. I echoed the word, letting it taste of all the years they had relegated me to the private shadows of their lives. No, Julian, I think we've had enough privacy. I think it's time for some light. The attorney opened the portfolio, revealing a single signature page. Whenever you're ready. Mrs. Vance. I picked up the pen again, but instead of signing, I pushed myself up and pulled my chair from the corner, scraping its legs deliberately against the marble floor until it was back at the head of the table. I sat down, the rightful matriarch, finally taking her seat. Then I looked directly at Serafina. You once called me a name on an old deed. I said, today I'm putting my name on everything you've ever wanted. Her eyes widened as I took a different set of documents from my handbag, documents prepared weeks ago by Elias's team. My silent heartbreak. It was not the sale agreement. I uncapped the pen and with a steady hand signed the last page. I was donating the entire Beaumont estate, land and property to the city of Charleston to establish the Vance Haven for Women, a sanctuary for elderly women who had been abandoned or abused by their families. A final clause, printed in unshakable legal type, stipulated that every plaque publication and fundraising event for the Haven would be required to list two honorary sponsors, Mr. Julian Vance and Mrs. Serafina Vance. Their names would be tied to this act of charity forever, a permanent monument to the prize they tried to steal. I slid the signed papers across the table. Finalize this immediately, I told the director. Julian's face was ashen. Mother, what have you done? I've ensured this house will be a place of kindness, I said evenly, and I've ensured your names will be remembered, just not how you planned. Serafina shot to her feet, sputtering, but the attorney cut her off. Oh, she can, he said, a note of finality in his voice. And she just did. The next morning, as they were still reeling, the second blow landed. South Carolina is a one-party consent state for recordings. For months, my phone had been silently recording Serafina's tirades, the particularly damning one where she detailed to a friend over wine her plans to ship the old bat to the cheapest state-run facility. The moment the papers were signed was sent to a well-connected local journalist. By noon, the audio was everywhere, in the tight-knit reputation obsessed circles of Charleston. It was a death sentence. The friends who had admired her ambition now crossed the street to avoid her. The business contacts Julian had cultivated for years suddenly stopped returning his calls. They had wanted the Beaumont estate to prove they belonged. Instead, they were left with a social stain that no amount of money could ever wash away. Their public image crumbled, and with it their financial empire. Investments were pulled. Partnerships dissolved. They sold the luxury cars. Then, the boat. 6 months later, they lost the house. Arthur and I had built the one they had made my prison one rainy afternoon. A knock came at my door. It was them. They looked drenched, not just by the rain but by failure. They looked smaller, stripped of their arrogance. Mom, Julian began, his voice hoarse. We have nowhere else to go. Serafina stood behind him, eyes fixed on the ground, the ghost of her own cruel words about nursing home, no doubt echoing in her ears. I stepped back, holding the door open. I LED them to the kitchen and poured them glasses of water, which they did not touch. We just need a place for a little while. Reflections on greed and betrayal. Julian pleaded. I sat across from them. The silence in the room a testament to all the things left unsaid. For years, I took a slow sip of my water. You know, I began my voice even and calm. I once heard you discussing a facility, one with clean rooms and friendly staff. You told me I had a choice to make. I looked from my son's desperate face to my daughter in Law's bowed head. Well, I made my choice, and for you. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The nursing home sounds perfect. You should try it. They flinched. There was no argument, no final appeal. They understood. This door and this part of my life was now closed to them. I walked them to the porch and watched them disappear into the gray drizzle. Their shoulders slumped in defeat. There was no joy in it, no triumph. There was only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a ledger finally balanced. The debt had been paid in full. The late afternoon sun now filters through the leaves of the camellia bushes in my courtyard garden. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and the faint briny tang of the nearby sea. I am on my knees, my hands deep in the rich dark earth, the familiar ache in my joints, a welcome reminder of honest work. A small hand-painted sign hangs on my garden gate. It reads Ilara's garden entry by invitation. Only it is not a barrier to keep the world out, but a declaration of the peace I have reclaimed within this space, this home, this life. It is mine, governed by my rules. The world still rushes on outside. These walls, but here time moves to the rhythm of a steady heartbeat. I stand and brush the soil from my hands, closing thoughts, my shadow long across the flagstones. Silence, I think, is not an absence of sound, it is a presence. It is the fertile ground where plans take root, and strength is gathered. They mistook my silence for surrender, my patience for weakness. They never understood that I was not fading away. I was simply waiting for the right moment to speak my final sentence. Not with shouts or fury, but in the only language they truly understood, consequences, and in the quiet of my reclaimed life, I had finally written an ending that no one, least of all them, ever saw coming. The story was now and forever my own.